Good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Andy Hawks and I'm the coordinator of public programs and public engagement here at the Whitney Museum. Closed captioning is available for tonight's program, so if you'd like to turn the captions on, click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to thank Jamie at SignNexus for providing the captions for tonight's program. Tonight's session is being recorded in case you'd like to rewatch, so keep an eye out in your inbox for a viewing link for this week and last week's session. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you tonight from the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, both past and present, currently known as Manhattan. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce the second session of our course, Approaches to Abstraction, Women Artists, 1930 to 1950, which is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Labyrinth of Forms, Women in Abstraction, 1930 to 1950. The exhibition is on view now until March 13th, so I encourage you to plan your trip to the museum to see the show if you haven't already. Today's session is taking place in the Sondra Gilman Works on Paper Study Center, which is devoted to studying works on paper and houses over 19,000 prints, drawings, and photographs here at the Whitney. And on that note, it is truly an honor to introduce our instructors for the evening, Sarah Humphreyville and Clara Rojas Sebesta. Sarah Humphreyville is a senior curatorial assistant who has been part of the curatorial team at the Whitney since 2013 and has been part of the teams for Vida Americana, Mexican Artists Remake America, 1925 to 1945, Agnes Pelton, Desert Transcendentalist, Grant Wood, American Gothic and Other Fables, among many other projects, including the exhibition on view here at the Whitney. Clara Rojas Sebesta is the museum's Ellsworth Kelly Conservator of Works on Paper and has been at the museum since 2015. At the end of the program, we'll have a short Q&A, so I encourage you all to send us questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can click the icon at the bottom of your screen and then type your question, and please feel free to submit questions through the duration of tonight's talk. We expect tonight's program to last until about 7 p.m. And with that, I will turn things over to Sarah and Clara. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Andy. So we're gonna focus tonight's talk on really printmaking methods, which I addressed a little bit in our session last week, and we're gonna cover a few broad categories of printmaking today. And as you may remember, from the talk last week, one of the things that we covered was intaglio printmaking as done at the Atelier 17 printmaking workshop. And just as a brief refresher, Atelier 17 was a really radical printmaking studio that really introduced the concept of a modern print to the United States when it moved here from Paris in 1940. So the idea was to combine a really radical way of thinking about art and what it could be, along with new techniques in printmaking. So intaglio, in its broadest sense, it means carving in Italian, and it as a medium actually covers a whole bunch of other printmaking, includes a lot of other printmaking media and words that you may have heard before, like etching and engraving, among others, and we're gonna dive into those. But in part to give you an idea of just how new the approach was being taken at this print shop, we thought we'd start off tonight with looking first at an Edward Hopper print, an etching that's really made in a much more traditional way. And the Whitney is lucky not just to have prints by Hopper, but also his plates. So I'll turn it over to Clara now to kind of walk through a little bit of what we're seeing in the plate here.
So as Sarah discussed, intaglio is carving and generally done on a metal plate here, copper or steel or zinc. And engraving would have referred to just digging directly into and carving directly into the metal plate, and that would be the area that held the ink that was then transferred onto paper. With Edward Hopper here, we have another traditional hard ground, so a very hard lacquer would have been placed overall on the metal plate, and then tools would have been used by Hopper to scratch away the lacquer, and it captures that gesture on the metal plate to give you a very nicely drawn line, as you can see here. The area is then exposed would have been, the plate is then put into an acid bath, and anywhere where the lacquer is scraped away is where the acid could bite away into the metal. The hard ground is then removed, the plate is inked overall, and then wiped away so that only the ink that remained in those deep grooves would create your image. Now at this point, these are the things you'd want to look for. When you're looking at a print, you can see the evidence of this etching process. You'll see at the edge of a plate it's beveled because a wet piece of paper would be placed on top and then it run through the press. So there's a lot of pressure, and the pressure is what pushes the paper into the grooves created by the acid and gives you your printed image. It's nice to be able to compare the plate to the prints. So you'll get to see a basic principle of intaglio is that you're actually getting a reversal. It's important to remember, as well as there's a freedom in how you wipe the plate that gives you a more artistic effect, and that this printmaking, which is essentially thought of as or can be thought of as a reproductive process, giving you an addition or similar prints over and over, there can actually be a lot of variability and artistic expression in the individual wiping the plate, and we'll talk about that with some of the artists today. So that's a sort of straightforward hard ground etching. So when we move next to Sue Fuller, as Sarah discussed that, she really experimented with some soft ground techniques, and we'll get into that in a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things to keep in mind with intaglio too is that you can use a number of different intaglio techniques on a single plate, so that an artist could use to refer to these two traditional methods that Clara just mentioned, engraving and hard ground etching, could use those in the same plates. And that was something that was happening really often at Atelier 17 with the experimental prints that they're doing. So in the Sue Fuller print, which is in the exhibition, we see her using soft ground etching, which is sort of a variation of the hard ground etching. And the adjectives are kind of obvious there, that you get a more malleable surface with the soft ground, as well as using stencils, which helps her get the color, and an embossing technique that's quite different than what we think of when we think of fancy invitations or something like that. So I think we can go into some details on this print and hopefully show you a little bit about what each of those things means and how those processes work.
Right. So with a soft ground, because it is malleable, she was able to lay lace, string, or anything else that had a texture that would create an impression in that soft ground, that wax, and therefore the acid in the bath would be able to etch differentially and really record all those different textures. And you can really see that in raking light. And this is one of the tools that conservators use and print connoisseurs use to reveal all the different textures. And you can see those textures and that dimensionality of these prints. That surface really comes to light when you use a flashlight and raking light, which is one of the tools, as well as magnification to look up really closely. And you can see Sue Fuller's strings, as well as the embossed areas that Sarah was referring to. And those are areas that were carved into the plate with various tools. And then when she was wiping, she would ensure that there was no ink in those deeper areas, giving us this raised, bright white area, which records the color, the tone of the paper.
Yeah, and as Clara mentioned before, when you're working with an intaglio print, the paper is wet when it's going over that plate. So as it's going through the press and getting all of that pressure, it's not just dry paper that's being pushed into the groove, it's wet paper, which really helps you get that raised quality. And so that's being combined with this soft ground, and soft ground also is one of the things that Atelier 17 really revolutionizes the way that people are thinking about that as a printmaking technique. It had really been something that was thought of as a way to sort of reproduce a drawing that you'd already done and disseminate it quite quickly, and it's much easier because of how sensitive that surface is to make a mark with it than it is with a hard ground surface, or certainly with engraving method where you don't have anything you're carving into, and it's actually quite physical and really can hurt your hand if you're not in shape with it. And so she's then taking that idea, as were other artists at the studio, and combining it with these real world objects like the lace, manipulating the lace to actually make it so that you can kind of see what it is, but also that it's in service of this broader abstraction. So that stretching of what the media could be, she really thought of specifically as a way to sort of combine like something about thinking about collage with printmaking. The other thing that we see in this print that's quite different, and you can really see it on the right edge in particular, but really anywhere where you see that red ink meeting the black, is that the workshop really came up with a new way to think about color printing. So typically if you're making an intaglio print with multiple colors, you're doing multiple runs through the press. You're thinking exactly about how the black and the red in this case relate to each other, and that's still happening, but they figured out how to do it simultaneously. So there's only one print through the press. All of the lining up of the colors is actually happening ahead of time. And they did this by using stencils, and I think by seeing kind of just how clean and crisp those lines are between the red and the black, is you can really see how somebody's lining that up. So to do that, you'd ink the plate in the way that Clara was talking about with the hopper plate, really making sure that your black ink gets into your grooves as needed, wiping it clean, and then you'd put on the red over it, using stencils to block out the areas that you didn't want to have that color in. So the Atelier 17 artists would typically make a print in just the black part and then figure out where they'd want these colors to go. And Fuller's just using 2 colors here, but some of the artists at the workshop used many, many more than that, sometimes up to, I can recall prints with at least 6 different colors in them, which is quite a technical feat. So moving on now to our next artist, who is also an Atelier 17 artist, Teresa DAmico for Palm. Clara was talking to us about the embossing technique and really prodding at the kind of literal depths of what printmaking could be, as an or what a sculptural application of printmaking could be, is something that Atelier 17 artists were really interested in, and embossing was one of the ways that this was achieved. And Forpom in particular really became known for pushing this method, which perhaps isn't surprising since she was a sculptor before she started working in printmaking. Forpom was born in Brazil and came to the US in 1941 to study at the Art Students League. And she had originally been making quite realistic sculpture, and she, like Fuller, really had her work transformed by the experience of being at Atelier 17, shifting quite quickly into working in abstraction. And she became so masterful at having these 3D applications of printmaking that when Stanley William Hayter, who was the founder of the print shop, wrote his book on what he called gravure, but essentially intaglio techniques, he actually singled her out as being the person at the print shop that most epitomized this, what they called graphage, but is embossing, that she was kind of highlighted for being the best of it. And this work, which you see on the screen that's recently come into the Whitney's collection, was actually owned by Hayter himself. So I think that also tells you just how much he really respected her work and what she was doing.
Yeah, and you can really see her playing with these soft textures. So in the upper left corner, you'll see a detail where she does have, you can see the mesh gauze that she's pressed into that soft ground. You can also, with soft ground, create drawn lines with crayons. So you can really see the ink pushing into those, that gauzy texture that she's used to create the soft sort of atmospheric. But in the other side of that print, where she's really more aggressively carved into the plate in the embossment there. And especially in raking light, you can really see how she's played with that dimensionality and inking. So revealed in light, this raking light, you can really see that dimensionality and how the ink has flowed into those darker areas. You can almost see the bubbles in the ink on the left side of the screen where the ink was forced in very viscous, thick layer there. So a lot of what we're trying to do when we're looking at prints is trying to reconstruct that process and the decision making. So what it does reveal is the decision making that the artist had. That white shape on the right is a combination of carving and then open acid biting, so that the acid is biting away at those etched areas, and you'll see these almost bubbles and rough edges along the, right here. That's a beautiful shot of those areas where the acid has really worked into that plate to create this movement and this organic shape. So she would have gone in during inking overall, forcing it into some of the darker areas and then wiping it out selectively. So it was a really painterly approach to printmaking. You can also see in raking light the cockling and buckling of the paper as it's gone through this through the press and through the printmaking process. And this is inherent to the work and not something that as a conservator we would want to change during treatment or examination, something we're really careful about preserving if anything needed to happen. So really beautiful printmaking. Here you can also try to reconstruct. It was kind of mysterious for us to try to figure out how those lines cross the curve in that depth of that white embossed area. She still has some very, very fine engraved lines that were preserved there. So really incredible working of that plate.
Yeah, and I think, picking up on how Clara was describing some of her processes being quite painterly, and thinking back to looking at those two hopper prints and talking about how the ink itself is something that can really be quite variable and something that's really part of the creative approach. In the flatter, not raised white passages in this part of the print, you can also see little leftover pieces of ink, and that's all done in how she's wiping the plate, but again really contributes to the overall feeling and rhythm of the work. And I think just how much she's done to get different types of 3D techniques, really taking that embossing a step beyond just leaving it white and getting the black in passages, combining with the open bite, figuring out how these lines cross over is one of the ways that you see her just really like prodding at what the boundaries of an intaglio print can be. And then in advancing on to our next work by Terry Haas, who's yet another artist who was working at Atelier 17, she too is also really playing with the three-dimensional qualities of the work. The work, Open Mind from 1948, I think is also really showing just how engaged she is overall in the design and thinking about how space emerges and recedes, and really working with a flat surface, but also with this ideas of planes and light and how they intersect. And she was really, really conceptually interested in the relationship between time and space and light. Or actually, she'd shift after working in printmaking for quite some time into making plexiglass sculptures. So I think in works like this, you can start to see that future interest really coming out. And then if we go into details here, I'll turn it over to Claire again, but we can really clearly in this detail, and especially with that raking light turned on, see just how three-dimensional this print is and its embossing.
Right, so there's these very clean lines that she was able to attain through the carving that space, and it's really remarkable, that circle, that precision that she had in control over the carving in the plate. You can also see in this light the choice of paper. So the paper has a texture in and of itself. So another decision that an artist will have to make is the heavy handmade paper or a thin paper. Those will all be variables in the appearance of that print, how many times it has to be worked through the plate. In addition to this embossing, I think just to the left, you would be able to see another innovation that Terry, this is again the layering, the white is an embossed area. The fine engraved lines that are below these other areas of dark inking, and then one more. Right. So this another innovation that Terry Haas really created a three-dimensional plate, adhering wires onto the plate. So we have this both protruding and receding images. So by adhering wires to the plate, she creates a colograph. So it's the wire that's holding the ink and creating these deep impressions in the paper. And you can see it in this wire spiral, this delightful sort of whimsical spiral that she's included in this plate.
Yeah, and really all over the plate you see these, this co-mingling of these impressions from the colograph, from the wire, and a colograph, just as a kind of basic definition, is using a real world object to make an impression into the paper. So as a word, it's a combination of colla taken from collage and then graph, meaning the print. And one of the things that I find so incredible about her and this work is that she's arriving at this technique before the technique has even been named. So it wasn't for another 7 years after she made this work that the term collograph was coined by another American artist, Glenn Alp. So she's, really, really thinking outside the boundaries of what can be done here, and perhaps it's not surprising that she is one of the women among the many women who worked at Atelier 17 who actually became a real leader at the print shop. She served as its co-director in the early 1950s, and Sue Fuller too was another major leader there who worked as a master printer. And these women were really respected as artists and peers of the male artists who worked there. So we'll switch gears a little bit, focusing off of intaglio now to talk about woodcut, and we'll talk about this work, Personal World by Anne Ryan, which is from 1946. So woodcut was also a technique that was taught at Atelier 17, and that's where Anne Ryan first learned how to do it. She first came to the workshop and was really working in intaglio, first came there in 1942, and she actually really decided to become an artist later in life, and the print shop was really the first place where she had a real community of artists that she was a part of in a regular way, as well as the first formal artistic training that she had. And so she really just soaked everything up. But eventually she really was producing prints more at home. So she was at the print shop for about 5 years, and then really bought like a tiny little press that she could have in her apartment, and then also had a big architectural table, probably not that dissimilar from the one that the print is resting on now, where she could do these woodblock prints. And she, like Haas, like Fuller, is also really using found materials in the service of printmaking. So you'll see that this work is on black paper. She used paper that was that a friend gave her that wrapped photographic paper to protect it from the light so that it wouldn't get overdeveloped before it needed to be used. And then she'd really, really carefully iron out all the creases in the work, although there's still some evidence of where those are. And then for her wood, she'd often use wood that was just found around her apartment. I think ply-off shingles or pieces of floorboard or kitchen cabinets, and we'll talk a little bit about where you can see the evidence of that too, really looking right at this corner right here.
Very clearly you can see where the hinges may have been located before, as well as the dovetailing in the corners of the frame and various points where the nail points might have been for the cabinet, as well as the overall wood grain here that she's then carved in to create the design. And unlike intaglio, where the ink is forced into the grooves, the ink is rolled over the whole surface, and where the carved in areas are carved in, it doesn't hold the ink, so that's where you'd print in. This is a very common printmaking technique. She also has hand applied a lot of different areas of color. These are sort of sparkly little uses of oil paint, silver metallic oil paint, and this is called, the title of this piece is?
Personal World.
Personal World, so it feels like little constellations of metallic pieces.
Yeah, and that use of oil paint was really important to her. I mean, she was not super concerned with having what the perfect technical definition of a woodcut was, and she used oil paint, I think in part because it was available, but in part because she liked the variability that she could get with it. So she experimented a lot with, certain areas that were more matte. You can tell in this work that certain areas have far more ink / paint applied to them than others, and that there's also a real variability in how hard you can tell that she's pressing, so that there's a sort of ripple quality that goes across the work. And she often really was using her hand as a way to get the material onto the surface of the paper. And sometimes she rolled the paint onto the blocks, and sometimes she actually would just wipe with her hands onto the blocks too. So even when she's making additions, you see a lot of difference in comparing and contrasting different impressions of each design with just what the tone of something is, or where certain pressure areas have been applied and that sort of thing.
And you can, in certain areas, you can see where those wrinkles left from the ironing still catch the ink and become part of the pattern as well. So that might have been appealing to her as a choice.
Yeah, absolutely. So shifting to the other side of the table, we'll talk about Sylvia Wald's from House of Stone 1 from 1954. And it is a screen print, which I imagine is something that, at least as a word, is probably quite familiar to people when, in art we think about Warhol, we think about screen printing. Also, even just like your simple souvenir T-shirt or whatever is often made using that method. But in the period of the show, in the period that we're talking about tonight, screen printing really wasn't something that was considered an artistic medium, not something worthy of the realm of fine art, certainly something that was much more commercial. And for those of you who joined our session last week, you might remember me talking about the Bay Area artist Stuart Bothwell as being one of the people who really advanced the idea that screen printing could be used as something for fine art, and was talking about herself as being such an innovative person for doing this. And she started screen printing in 1943, but Wald was even a few years earlier than that. She first exhibited her screen prints in 1940. The first works that she made were in a much more social realist vein, but by a few years into the 1940s, she'd really shifted into thinking about abstraction, was inspired by surrealism and thinking about biomorphism, and then really became known as being one of the people that really pushed screen printing, also known as silk screening, into the realm of fine art and helping it get accepted that way. And I think part of the way that she does that is by pushing at the boundaries of what the print can do and what the medium means, very similar to what a lot of the Atelier 17 artists were doing with intaglio. So she really becomes known for these abstract prints that also have a lot of texture. So if you want to talk about really what a traditional silkscreen is, but also then what she's doing that's different.
Right, so I think she sort of rejected sort of that perfect edge that we would associate with an Andy Warhol repeated shape, that stenciling. So to create this print, she would have set a tone, a play tone in the back, and she's taking advantage of sort of variable, the way you would press the ink through the screen print is with a squeegee, and then when you pull the screen away, the suction and the different viscosity of that ink would create these beautiful sort of organic branch-like places where the ink remained on that back tone area. And this is inspired by the stone wall in her house. So she's sort of recalling that and taking advantage of the accidental, which is something that the surrealists really called upon, and taking these organic shapes. So further layers of stenciling, you'll see that she takes advantage of in these white shapes, or these other shapes that go on. Okay, okay. So in Breaking Light, you can see that those beautiful ink, sort of thicker applications of ink from that suction of the screen pulling off. And then she's layering the white over that and taking advantage of that accident, which mostly you would want to avoid if you're trying to create that perfect screen print, but really taking advantage of that accident of the white over the black to create these beautiful layered prints. And it also seems that she's changing the pressure, because you can see in that other white shape in the lower left corner, a shifting, which we would normally associate with a changing in registration, or a shifting of that screen, a jiggling of that. So she's creating these beautiful, beautiful textures, and the bubbling of the ink all adds to this really organic, this beautiful, earthy stone treatment of this print. So really taking advantage of and manipulating and controlling the accidental to create this.
Yeah, and I think that embrace of the accident, the idea that you're really doing something that's moving beyond just strict reproducibility, is something that really helps her argument that screen printing can be used for something that's not just commercial, and it can be used for artistic ends, and that those textures, that kind of purposeful moving or misregistration is all something that really contributes not only to her overall design, but what she's actually trying to achieve on behalf of her chosen medium, which is really really quite quite remarkable. And it's, it's such a treat to be able to look at a work like this one, especially in the study center where we get to look at it without glass on top of it, which sometimes sort of numbs some of these details. And we're also looking at it with Clara's raking light in some cases so that those details really pop out. And with that light, too, we get to kind of do the puzzle solving aspect that is always part of looking at prints.
Right.
So thinking about techniques that really became accepted now as fine art media, but were not considered so in the 1930s and 1940s, we also thought that we would talk a little bit tonight about lithography. So we'll shift gears and shift tables and start talking about June Wayne, who's really responsible for being one of the people that moves lithography from the realm of commercial reproduction into accepted territory for fine art. And we talked about Wayne a little bit last week as well. As a bit of a recap, she began working with lithography in 1948. She arrived at it after feeling like painting really wasn't fulfilling what her conceptual aims in her work was. She was actually particularly frustrated by the fact that oil paint kind of changed as it dried, and that colors related to each other differently, and that certain ones shrunk more than others, and has at certain points in interviews actually really ranted at just how mutable oil paint is, even though we think of it as something that's a fixed, very stable object. And I think she also found color to be a little bit distracting from what she was trying to do. She, like Terry Haas, was really interested in the relationship between time and space and light, and did a lot of reading in optics, and felt that lithography would actually be a better medium for what she was trying to accomplish. And as she's thinking about this, she also hears a rumor that someone has actually opened a fine art lithography studio just 6 blocks away from her in Los Angeles. And so she marches down to what is Linton Kistler's garage at that point, and he had been a commercial lithographer who decided as a hobby to work with fine artists and make fine art lithographs. Marched down there, convinced him to rent her a lithographic stone, which is very heavy, got it moved up 6 blocks to her apartment, and went to work and worked with Kistler for about a decade, and really pushed him, I think, to think about what lithography could be as well. And then really most famously, the part of her career comes right after that is what she's known for and what her big contribution to American art is. So this is an early print from 1950 that we're looking at, but in 1959 she wrote a grant application to the Ford Foundation to fund a lithography studio. Kistler had retired at that point from the fine art practice, and in 1960 she launched the Tamarind Workshop, which is really one of the places where the print renaissance and the US starts in the 1960s, and really is bringing lithography to many, many artists, and many artists are doing residencies there, making prints and so on. So I think lithography, though, is one of those media. I mean, you just heard me talk about her trying to transport a rock up to her apartment, and that's, I think, one of the places where we're just kind of going, wait, what is this medium? How does it work? So thought that you could maybe, kind of explain to people in more basic terms about what goes into that process and how you go from having a boulder to having a print.
It's interesting that she switched from oil painting, which has this incredible tactile quality, to the lithograph, which is also described as a planographic, because it's literally a flat plane of printing ink. So the stone would have held, lithography is based on the principle of grease and water not mixing. So a stone would have been carved, and the texture of that stone would hold onto a greasy crayon, pencil, touche, which is a liquid waxy drawing material. So she would draw out her image, or one would draw out your image onto that stone, and then etch it with nitric acid and gum arabic, creating all the areas that didn't hold that you're drawing. making those attractive for water, and then your image would be attracting to grease. So it's, again, creating a matrix where non-image attracts water and rejects ink, and your drawing material actually attracts the ink. You would then wet the stone and then roll your ink, and all the wet areas would repel the ink, and so your drawing material would be held in those inked etched areas. A piece of paper is laid on top and run through the press, and creating this very thin layer of image. So unlike your woodcut or your intaglio, it's not occurring at this level. It's all sitting on the surface in this chemical reaction that happens on a stone, and then later zinc plates, because stones became rare and hard to move around.
Yeah, you can't just use any stone for store. Right. The rock that you pick up in your backyard is not going to be suitable for this
More
purpose.
Expensive, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there was definitely at some point kind of a run on the quarries for these stones. But so Wayne, once she opens the Tamarind Workshop, again, is not just working with herself as an individual artist, but really working on bringing artists from across the country together and in thinking about what lithography can be and how to push it, and really introducing people to lithography who may not have even thought that they wanted to be printmakers, or that they would have had a natural aptitude for this medium. So it becomes, at a place like this, a real collaboration between the master printmaker and the artist, and working together jointly to make works. Of course, some of the artists who came there actually had a background in printmaking, one of them being Louise Nevelson. And I think in comparing these two works, Majesty on the left, which is a work that Nevelson actually made at Atelier 17. She worked there in a couple different stints, the first from 1952 to 1953, and then came back in the fall of 1954. She made tons of prints while she was there. She had about 29 plates, made hundreds of prints, and the prints that she made there also really helped inspire her painted wood sculptures that she's really well known for. But then in 1963, she went to Tamarind and started making lithographs like this one. So this is one of the works that could be considered part of that print renaissance. Certainly brings us into the next chapter of American printmaking. And I also love that you can really see in this comparison, just how differently the inks sit on the plate, and how different the blacks appear, and that sort of thing. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
And the way everyday objects, so in the print on the right, you can see a lace doily that would have been incorporated in a more photographic manner. Rather than capturing the texture, it's more of the silhouette. So a really different focus and understanding on how that image would be created.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think with that, we'll now welcome Andy back into the mix, and welcome all of you, our audience members, to have some questions for either one of us or for both of us, and thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for this informative talk. It's been so fantastic to look at these works with you all and think about the way that these artists were approaching the material and experimenting that way. I have a few questions here from the folks that have been tuned in. And the first is more about the role of the multiple. So thinking about how printmaking is really thought of as making an addition, and making identical sets of prints that are sort of, unlike a painting, not unique into themselves, but in a group. How interested were these artists in replication, in the addition, in making a repeatable sort of thing?
I think it depends on the artist, and also what the context that they were working in was. And it certainly was not, the prevailing principle at Atelier 17 at all. There were certainly additions made there, and Sue Fuller really was probably one of the more principled people when it came to writing down what her edition size was, and numbering and signing her prints and that sort of thing. But really, since the experimentation was at the forefront of what they were doing and was emphasized by Hayter and all the artists that were working there, the addition was sort of incidental to what else was going on. So you would often, maybe describe something as an edition because you knew it had been, but you wouldn't necessarily know what the size of the edition is or how many actually survived from the print run. You know, that weren't necessarily treated as super precious objects and archived in flat files and handled a certain way, which, you know, would have been the practice or is the practice at Tamarind. As, you know, the kind of field has maybe become a little bit more professionalized. Or
when did collectors start become interested in this? Because that would be the pressure on editioning.
Right, and yeah, there's no market for prints, for modern prints really at this point either. So that takes away some of that pressure, certainly. And I think one of the things that you see with Atelier 17 prints in particular is that an artist might be using a plate in a certain configuration of colors or printing at certain states, and then you'll see another print with the same design with a totally different palette. And so, you know, the idea of an edition is much more fluid there.
Which falls in line with sort of the painterly approach to
definitely
dealing with the plate and creating monotypes, monoprints.
Yeah, it's seeing what can happen and really, I think, reveling in that variation. And certainly Anne Ryan's woodcuts would fall into that category too. So the idea of the edition is there, but it's not necessarily super strict.
Yeah, you showed me some beautiful Minnesintron prints that had variability in color. They were beautiful.
Yeah, if you get really lucky, every once in a while an institutional collection has multiple versions of the printing in different states, but also in different color configurations. And Minnesintron, who is one of the Atelier 17 artists in the exhibition, has a whole collection of prints at the Huntington Museum in San Marino, where you can really see those differences. So if you have the time to go online and look at their website, I think that's one way to check that out.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think the next question is a little bit more for Clara. Thinking about how you approach looking at these works, there's almost a forensic quality to it. How important is it for you as a conservator to understand how a work was made in order to care for that work?
Great question. So, as I mentioned, when thinking about the planar distortions, that dimensionality of the print, if I didn't understand the nature of printmaking, I would perhaps attribute that to a condition issue that would need to be addressed. So we do, as conservators, try to really carefully examine, document, and understand artist decision-making, artist material choices, and techniques and processes before we can make any kind of treatment decision. Display all these different choices would be really important. So we use raking light, UV light, magnification, all these different ways of examining prints and just getting up close and personal.
Yeah, and I think forensics is a really good word for it, for whoever asked that question.
No, it was interesting that the word forensic came up. I think a little bit about the flashlight might have took it to like a CSI kind of level. Yeah. Another question I think is about improvisation, and I think that we associate a lot of abstract art with jazz and that. What role did improvisation play in making these works, specifically with the Sue Fuller? Was this really a planned out composition? Was she responding to the materials as she was making them? Is that something you can tell from looking at it? But could you speak a little bit about her practice?
Yeah, so I mean, Fuller, as I just said, was maybe a little more attentive to the idea of an edition, which would kind of be against the idea of improvisation. But there are variations in, you know, just how that red stenciling gets lined up from print to print. I mean, they're pretty minor. But Fuller really was quite designed into how she made her work. So she, you know, the use of soft ground was all over the place at Atelier 17. People were really experimenting with it, and we saw it in the Four Palm work as just one other example. And if you come to the show or look at the show online, you'll see other examples of artists using that too. Fuller did something a little bit different than other people, though. She didn't want to really just rely on, you know, pushing something down into the soft ground and seeing what happened. And as I showed as I showed in our presentation last week, she actually figured out that she could create, kind of set up like an empty wooden frame and then stretch these strings and lace across it and actually kind of create this assemblage before she put it down onto the surface, so that when she's laying down that composition, she has a really fixed idea of what it's going to look like. And so then she, rather than laying down a bunch of things and sort of hoping that it happens a certain way or waiting for it to happen a certain way, she's just, with a lot of control, actually putting that wooden frame down onto the plate so that everything is kind of set up in such a way. And she eventually became so kind of enchanted by or interested in this process that those actually evolved into their own artworks and became what she called string compositions, which would eventually kind of get laid into plexiglass too. So I think, how much she's thinking about exactly how to pull the lace in a certain way and exactly what a particular hole in it or reconfiguration of that original material might look like. I'm sure there's a bit of improvisation, but obviously also a moment of decision of saying, yeah, that looks exactly right. That's how I want to put it down, and that's what the composition is. And I think that in that print, in particular, that kind of combination of the much more geometric, not quite grid-like, but sort of grid-like structure with the string, in contrast with the lace feeling much more organic, is part of what gives that print a real vibrancy with its textures, but also in just how different the lines look with each other.
Right, great. Well, I suppose on that note, there's another question about the role of finances and experimentation. Were any of these artists drawn to the printmaking specifically because it might have had or felt like it had lower stakes, since the cost of materials might be lower, or how did the finances of making these experimental prints come into play, and did it? I think specifically with the back of a cabinet door.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in Ryan's case, she really did not have very much money to work with at all. So certainly her use of her cabinet door, in the case of Personal World or other found wood objects for her prints, is a direct result of that, and her use of this black photographic paper that her friend gave her also really helped out financially too. But it also, she was obviously getting results that she liked and was excited by with it too. So that's maybe a marriage of circumstance and result working out quite well in her case. Yes, paints are more expensive, but I also think artists are going to do what they are going to do, and to have the best results that they want to do, and people figure it out, and the artists had different financial circumstances and different successes. I think, as I said before, there's really no market for modern prints, or very minimal market, so it certainly wasn't something that people were like, oh, well, if I go in, I can sell 50 of these really quickly, and that'll be much, much easier than selling one painting. I don't think that's the type of calculation that someone is making, but one advantage that these women printmakers in particular had was that working with the print shops also helped give them exhibition opportunities. So Atelier 17 had shows during this period that would sometimes be in gallery spaces, sometimes be in museums, and prints are also a lot easier to pack up and travel. And this is also an era where you're having print annuals at museums and that sort of thing. And the artists often actually also really worked with each other and helped each other get their prints ready for shows. Anne Ryan and Sue Fuller were really good friends. Ryan was also very good friends with a younger artist, Warden Day, who she also really helped take Ryan's work around. And that was something that not only gave them just the opportunity to get their work out, and that feels good, but really helped establish their professional reputation. So I think there is opportunity in that sense that printmaking provided that that painting perhaps didn't, especially as a market is maybe becoming a little more established for contemporary American art and contemporary American abstract art, that we see a lot of attention being paid to the Jackson Pollocks and Willem de Koonings, and I think it becomes much more male as it becomes much more marketable. So, so printmaking gave them opportunities in that sense.
And a question building off of that was, were these artists, their new and innovative techniques, were they acknowledged at the time by critics and by their contemporaries?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, Atelier 17 was well respected. They had shows, that they set up themselves, but there was also, really importantly, a show in 1944 that MoMA organized, and that a version of that show ended up traveling not just in the U.S. but to Latin America as well. And there's a lot in the press about those group shows, and that's one of the ways that these professional reputations are getting established, is that not only are these exhibitions being staged, but some of the women artists in the show are actually getting singled out. And as I mentioned in talking about Forpom, the founder of the print shop himself, an artist, really acknowledged her as being, the epitome of excellence when it came to these 3D printmaking techniques. And other male artists in the studio are also collaborating with these women and respecting them and working side by side with them. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I think there's a little bit of a technical question I'm going to throw to Clara. What types of paper were specifically used in these prints, and how did those choices affect the way that you preserve and store and minimize the aging of these works? We don't get to see a lot of these works don't get to come out of storage very often. So, could you speak a little bit about how these works are preserved? And
Sure. So the primary way of preserving most works on paper would be to reduce exposure to light, because light catalyzes the degradation of cellulose in paper. The higher quality papers, thicker papers that are generally used for intaglio, because they do, especially something like the Forpom, where you see that dimensionality, a thin paper would have torn. So she had to choose something very heavy, very strong to take that dimensionality. So we would preserve it with proper housing, with the mats that you've seen on some of the prints here, and proper storage here in the Works on Paper Study Center in acid-free boxes and proper framing materials. So those are in terms of post-production preservation. But the artist making choices, Anne Ryan, she used the black paper that was available to her. It gave her a different contrast, a different response to the ink. So those choices are something the artist would have made because they wanted the effect that they wanted. It's not necessarily that they're thinking of long-term preservation. Black paper is relatively stable, so again, just protecting it from light.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that when we're organizing a permanent collection exhibition, particularly as curators or working with Whitney objects in loan shows, Clara is one of my first stops for works on paper. That what's the exhibition history of this work? How long can it be on view? What's healthy for this piece and its longevity? So there is a real collaboration with our conservation team when we're thinking about assembling shows. In the case of this show, we're actually really, I guess in some ways, lucky to be able to have a long print run, in part because so many of these artists have been so overlooked for so long that the work, hadn't really been shown often, or some of the works, even in the Whitney's collection, are on view for the first time in this show. Only 2 or 3 works in the show have even been on view in this millennium. None of them have been up in this building before, which is an additional plug for you to come see these works while you can. Yeah. And we also have some new acquisitions. The Fuller and the Forpom and the Haas are all new to the collection as well. So that is really giving us a chance to show off these new acquisitions alongside these sort of longer buried treasures.
Well, great. So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and it's a bit of a meaty one. Could you both speak a little bit about the relationship between, obviously we're focused on printmaking, but these artists weren't just working in printmaking. Could you speak a little bit about the relationship between these artists' work in other media? Did printmaking inform their work in other materials that you can see? Specifically with Anne Ryan, did she use printmaking in her collage? Or was there any relationship between Nevelson's prints and her large-scale sculptures?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I talked a little bit before about how Fuller really evolved these string compositions that she's, mostly known for directly out of her printmaking practice. So we, there's a very through line, so to speak, between her earlier printmaking practice and her later sculptural practice. And I think, for Nevelson too, the way that she was working with her plates, it was, quite sculptural, and she also, really was aggressively inking these intaglio plates that, even in a space that was as experimental as Atelier 17, kind of drove some of the other people working there a little crazy, because she just sort of ended up like oozing ink all over the place. But I think you see that sort of textural relationship between how she's working with these found wood objects and painting them, with some of the ways in how she applies her ink to her plates. I also mentioned before that the ideas that Terry Haas is engaged with in terms of the relationship between time and space and light that we first see her engaged with in a work like Open Mind, is that something that then really continues to inspire her as an idea, and eventually provokes her to seek out plexiglass as a material. So I think sometimes it's not necessarily the process of printmaking, but the ideas that are already there, and the kind of continual evolution of how an artist is thinking about something. And for Anne Ryan and the collages, I think printmaking was one way into art, and using found material. She's also continuing to use found material in those collages and those really lovely, delicate, torn up pieces of paper. I think there's kind of something akin to that. That sort of scavenging or something that is there, and certainly in Sylvia Wald too, we see a lot of that same expressive quality in her screen prints and her paintings from the same period. So, some cases maybe a little bit more of a direct inspiration. Some cases kind of maybe just kind of a symptom of an overall artistic tendency or practice. But I don't think for any of them that their printmaking feels disconnected from other things that they did or are perhaps better known for, although I think some of these people, like June Wayne, are really primarily printmakers.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to make time for one more question, and it's from me that I hope both of you can answer. One of the fantastic things about tonight was slowing down and looking at these works in such an in-depth way that I don't think that I've done in the galleries very often. If you could sort of leave folks with one thing to change the way that they look at a print, or a technique that helps you when you look at a print, could you share that maybe?
Well, you'll always know a conservator is looking at a print or work in the gallery, because they'll sort of change their perspective. It won't be a head-on view. They'll use the gallery lighting, because obviously we can't use flashlights when we're visiting galleries, not usually anyway. So get low, get high, just change your angle, change your perspective, and get as close as the guards will let you get to really ask yourself, well, how did they do that? And use the clues that are there on the surface. Look for that beveled edge of that print. Look for the layering of colors. Look for textures that might be a soft ground or hard ground. Try to imagine yourself making that mark and thinking about the printmaking techniques. Once you've decided it's intaglio or a screen print or a woodcut, are they following the rules? What rules are they breaking? Just kind of really work through how did they do that? How did the artist, put yourself in the place of the artist and think about the material choices that they're making.
Yeah, and I would say that my approach is really, really similar. I think, I maybe have a little bit of a different background than many curators do. I have a BFA. I took printmaking classes. I struggled in my printmaking classes, but I learned a lot from them. And whether it's a print or a painting or a sculpture, whatever the medium is, I think the first question that I always approach a work of art with is, how is it made, but also how is it made functioning in relationship to what the artist is trying to do conceptually. And that really, like, for me, like when something really works works as an art object. It's those two things working in tandem and really coming together. But I like Clara, also do a lot of this kind of like awkward dance around an object and really push the lines of how close I'm allowed to get to something. I've definitely been scolded in the galleries and at other museums more than once, and part of it is in, you know, trying to see, you know, you're like convinced you can see through something if you do that or whatever. But yeah, definitely how it's made, and one of the things that I feel like I do in that process is to sort of kind of, and I think it goes to your point about rule breaking, is kind of just like what looks weird here, what looks a little different and intriguing as to how it's made, or like why are these two colors next to each other, and how does that work within the larger composition. And so this kind of sort of moving back and forth between the micro and the macro in the image is, I think really helpful. So I also, in addition to moving around, also kind of go back and forth a lot, and I think that's one of the ways you see it too. Plus, you know, you get in your steps, you know, checking off those New Year's resolutions. So yeah.
But yeah.
Thank you.
It was the important word was time. Give yourself time to do it.
So I'll start bobbing and weaving a little bit more when I look at these works. Well, we're at time, so I want to thank you both for sharing your expertise with us, for looking at these works with us. I want to encourage everyone at home to plan your visit to the Whitney if you haven't already. The exhibition Labyrinth of Forms closes March 13th, so I encourage you all to make a trip here and have a fantastic night and stay safe. Bye-bye.